Summer, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The air hung thick and humid over the endless prairie, carrying with it the scent of wheat fields stretching toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far from the battlefields of Europe. Behind double rows of barbed wire, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited in a world suspended between past and future, between the Reich they'd fought for and an America they'd been taught to despise. Among them, 22-year-old Feldwebel Heinrich Bauer stood at the mess hall entrance, his stomach tight with hunger and something else he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. The same qualities that had earned him an Iron Cross second class at Monte Cassino now seemed small and pointless in this flat, strange land, where everything felt wrong, including the food. Especially the food. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more historical narratives that bring the past to life. The morning sun beat down on the compound as prisoners lined up for breakfast, shuffling forward in worn Wehrmacht uniforms, stripped of insignia, their faces gaunt from the Atlantic crossing and weeks of adjustment to captivity. Heinrich had been at Concordia for 3 weeks now, transferred from a temporary facility in New York after his capture in Tunisia. 3 weeks of watching his countrymen struggle with the abundant but alien American diet. 3 weeks of hearing complaints muttered in Low German and Bavarian dialects about food that bore no resemblance to Schwarzbrot and Kartoffeln. The Americans fed them well, he had to admit that much. Too well, perhaps. The portions were enormous, wasteful even, heaped onto metal trays by cheerful mess sergeants who seemed genuinely concerned that the prisoners might not have enough. But quantity wasn't quality, and quality wasn't familiarity. Private First-Class Bobby Jenkins, a farm boy from Iowa, with a round face and an easy smile, worked the serving line that morning, his movements practiced and efficient. He'd been assigned to Camp Concordia since its opening, one of the 150 American soldiers tasked with guarding and managing thousands of enemy prisoners. At 19, Bobby had never expected to spend his war ladling food instead of firing rifles, but he'd accepted his posting with the same good-natured pragmatism he applied to everything. The prisoners were just men, he figured. Hungry men far from home. Same as he'd be if the circumstances were reversed. He didn't understand their complaints about the food, though. The army fed them the same rations the American troops got, maybe even better. Fresh eggs most mornings, real butter, and bacon. Beautiful, crispy strips of bacon that Bobby had grown up eating every Sunday after church. Heinrich reached the front of the line and held out his tray. Bobby smiled and used tongs to place 4 thick strips of bacon beside 2 fried eggs and a heap of grits. The bacon still sizzled slightly, rendering fat pooling at the edges of the tray. Heinrich stared at it, his jaw tightening. He'd tried bacon exactly once since arriving at Concordia. Once was enough. The texture was wrong, simultaneously crispy and greasy. The flavor was overwhelming. Sweet and salty and smoky all at once, nothing like the lean speck or schinken of home. It sat heavy in the stomach, made him think of excess and waste, made him think of everything the propaganda had said about American decadence. Bobby noticed the prisoner's expression, the barely concealed disgust flickering across his face. He'd seen it before, seen it 100 times, and it bothered him more than he liked to admit. What was wrong with bacon? Good American bacon, cured and hickory smoked, the kind his mother sent from the farm in care packages that never quite made it past the base kitchen. He wanted to ask, wanted to understand, but the language barrier made real conversation difficult. Most of the prisoners spoke little or no English, and Bobby's German consisted of about 10 words, half of them learned from war movies that probably weren't accurate anyway. Heinrich carried his tray to one of the long wooden tables where his barracks mates had gathered. They ate in small groups, divided by region and rank, despite the Americans' attempts to mix them. Old habits died hard, even in captivity. He sat beside Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffmann, a thin, intense man from Hamburg who'd served as a radio operator in the Afrika Korps. Klaus was pushing his bacon around his plate with undisguised contempt, his fork scraping against metal. "Schweinefleisch," Klaus muttered. "They call this breakfast. This is kitchen trash. In Hamburg we would feed this to dogs." Several others nodded agreement. Wolfgang Schneider, a former infantryman from Bavaria with a thick accent even in German, made a face as he attempted a bite. "Too much salt, too much fat. How do Americans eat this every day and not die?" Heinrich cut into his eggs, focusing on them instead. The eggs were acceptable, even good. Properly cooked, with yolks that ran just slightly when pierced. But the bacon sat there, mocking him with its alien presence. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Stuttgart, the smell of fresh bread baking, the simple meals of his childhood. Potatoes and cabbage, sausage made by the butcher down the street, lean and perfectly spiced. Food that made sense, food that tasted like home. Across the compound, in the American mess hall, Sergeant Thomas Patterson sat with his coffee and observed the morning routine through the window. At 34, he was older than most of the enlisted men, a veteran of the First World War who'd re-enlisted after Pearl Harbor despite his age. He'd been assigned as the senior NCO for prisoner services, a role that involved more diplomacy than he'd expected. The prisoners were complicated, he'd learned. Not the mindless fanatics of propaganda posters, but ordinary soldiers who'd followed orders and now found themselves trapped in the middle of nowhere, eating food they hated and waiting for a war to end. Thomas had noticed the food issue early on. The camp commander, Colonel Morrison, had raised it in staff meetings. Waste was becoming a problem. The prisoners were throwing away pounds of perfectly good food, particularly the bacon. Some mornings, nearly half of it ended up in the trash, and that didn't sit well with anyone, not when rationing was still in effect back home and American families were doing without. The colonel had asked Thomas to find a solution, to figure out why the prisoners were rejecting such a fundamental part of the American diet. That afternoon, Thomas approached Bobby Jenkins in the supply room where the young private was inventorying canned goods. "Private, I need you to do something for me. Something a bit unusual." Bobby straightened, automatically coming to attention. "Yes, Sergeant." "At ease, son. This isn't about regulations." Thomas pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for Bobby to do the same. "I need you to talk to some of the prisoners. Find out what exactly they don't like about our food, particularly the bacon. The colonel's getting pressure from above about the waste, and I figure if we understand the problem, maybe we can address it." Bobby frowned, uncertain. "My German's not very good, Sergeant." "I know. But you're friendly, and the prisoners seem to respond better to you than to most of the guards. There's a few who speak decent English. Start with them. Ask questions. Listen. Think you can do that?" "I can try, Sergeant." The next morning, Bobby made a point of watching the prisoners more carefully as they moved through the serving line. He noticed the way some of them hesitated when they reached the bacon, the way others took it but left it untouched on their trays. He spotted Heinrich, recognized him as one of the men who always looked particularly unhappy with his meals. The young German had an intelligent face, sharp eyes that seemed to take everything in. Bobby had heard from one of the interpreters that this one spoke some English, had learned it in school before the war. As Heinrich passed with his tray, Bobby called out, "Excuse me, you speak English?" Heinrich paused, surprised. Most of the guards didn't initiate conversation. He nodded slowly. "Some. Not perfect." "That's okay. Mine's not perfect either, and it's the only language I got." Bobby smiled, trying to seem approachable. "Can I ask you something? About the food?" Heinrich's expression became guarded. "What about it?" "Well, I notice a lot of you fellows don't care for the bacon. I'm curious why. It's good bacon, you know, farm fresh, properly cured. Where I come from, folks would be mighty pleased to have bacon like this." For a moment, Heinrich considered walking away. Then something in the young American's face, a genuine curiosity without mockery, made him reconsider. It is not what we are used to. In Germany, we eat different foods. The taste is strange to us. Strange how? Heinrich struggled for the English words. Too much, sweet, and fat. German bacon is not like this. More thin, more lean. This is like... He searched his vocabulary and found an approximation, like candy meat. Bobby couldn't help but laugh, though he tried to stifle it quickly when he saw Heinrich's face harden. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. Candy meat. That's just... I never thought of it that way. He considered this. So it's too rich for you? Rich. Yes, this word. Too rich. Other prisoners were backing up behind Heinrich, waiting to move forward. Bobby nodded toward an empty table. Listen, you mind sitting and talking for a few minutes? I'd really like to understand this better. Sergeant Patterson asked me to find out what the problem is. Heinrich hesitated, then shrugged. What else did he have to do? He followed Bobby to the table and sat, uncomfortably aware that several of his countrymen were watching with suspicion. Talking too freely with the guards could earn you a reputation as a collaborator, and nobody wanted that, even in a camp as relatively relaxed as Concordia. Bobby sat across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. So, help me understand. You're hungry, right? I mean all of you. You come through that line, and I can see you're hungry. But then you won't eat the bacon, even though it's protein and fat and everything your body needs. Why not just eat it anyway? Heinrich looked down at his tray, at the cooling strips of meat that represented everything foreign about this place. Is not just about hungry, he said carefully, is about, what is the word? Identity. In Germany, we eat certain way. Food is part of who we are. When we eat this American food is like we are losing ourselves. You understand? Bobby did understand, more than he expected to. He thought about his mother's cooking, the way it connected him to home, to his childhood, to everything familiar. If someone had tried to feed him something completely alien, would he eat it? Or would he resist, clinging to what he knew? I think I get it, Bobby said slowly. But here's the thing, you're going to be here for a while. The war's not ending tomorrow, and you need to eat, need to keep your strength up. Starving yourselves, throwing away good food, that doesn't hurt us. It hurts you. You think we do not know this? Heinrich's voice carried an edge now. You think we are stupid? We know we must eat, but every day we are told through this food that we are defeated, that we must become American, that everything we knew is wrong. The honesty of this stopped Bobby cold. He'd never considered that the bacon might represent something larger, something symbolic. To him, it was just breakfast. But to these men, every meal was a reminder of their situation, of how far they were from home, and how thoroughly their world had changed. Thomas Patterson appeared at Bobby's elbow, having been watching the exchange from across the room. Making progress, Private? Both men looked up, startled. Bobby started to stand, but Thomas waved him back down. The sergeant pulled out a chair and joined them, looking directly at Heinrich. I'm Sergeant Patterson. I'm in charge of prisoner services here. Private Jenkins tells me you've been explaining the food situation. Heinrich nodded warily. Let me ask you something, Thomas continued. If we could get German food or something closer to what you're used to, would you eat it? Would the others? Of course. But this is not possible. Maybe not exactly the same, but closer. We've got some flexibility in how we prepare things. The army wants you fed, but they don't much care how it happens, as long as it meets nutritional requirements and stays within budget. Thomas leaned back, studying the young German. What if we work together on this? You tell us what would make the meals more acceptable, and we see what we can do. In return, you and your friends stop wasting half of what we serve you. Heinrich felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in months. Not hope exactly, but possibility. You would do this. Within reason. I can't promise German food exactly, but I can promise we'll try to meet you halfway. Thomas stood. Think about it. Talk to the others. Let us know what might work. Over the following days, an unlikely collaboration began to take shape. Heinrich, initially reluctant, found himself drafted as an unofficial liaison between the prisoners and the American kitchen staff. He'd never asked for the role, but his English made him useful, and something in him responded to the challenge. Klaus Hoffmann and several others were skeptical, viewing any cooperation with suspicion, but the majority of prisoners were simply tired of being hungry, tired of forcing down food that made them feel worse instead of better. The first real breakthrough came during a sweltering afternoon when Heinrich found himself in the kitchen itself, an unprecedented privilege that made some of the guards uncomfortable. Roy Duplantis had insisted, arguing that he couldn't properly understand what Heinrich wanted without showing him the ingredients and techniques available. Colonel Morrison had reluctantly agreed, provided 2 guards were present at all times. Heinrich stood in the large institutional kitchen, surrounded by gleaming metal surfaces and industrial-sized equipment that dwarfed anything he'd seen in civilian life. The scale of everything overwhelmed him. In Germany, even before the war, resources had been carefully managed, rationed, preserved. Here, abundance seemed to be the operating principle. Sacks of flour stacked against walls, enormous cuts of meat in cold storage, crates of fresh vegetables delivered weekly from local farms. Roy gestured to a side of pork hanging in the walk-in cooler. That's where your bacon comes from. We cure it ourselves right here in camp. Started doing that about 6 months ago when supply lines got unpredictable. Learned from a sergeant who grew up on a hog farm in Tennessee. He pulled out a large slab of cured belly, the meat striped with fat. This is what we've been serving you. Sugar cure, like I mentioned, takes about 2 weeks to cure properly, then we smoke it with hickory. Heinrich examined the meat, noting the thick layers of fat marbling through it. In Germany, we cut away much of this fat before curing. The bacon is more lean. That's what gives it flavor, though, Roy protested. The fat's the best part. For Americans, maybe. For Germans, this is too much. We want to taste the meat, not the grease. Heinrich struggled to explain a cultural preference that went deeper than simple taste. German cuisine had been shaped by centuries of scarcity, by the need to make limited resources stretch as far as possible. Fat was valuable, but not to be indulged in wastefully. American abundance offended some fundamental sense of propriety, even when hunger said otherwise. Roy stroked his chin, thinking, what if I cure it the same way but trim more of the fat before cooking? Would that help? Perhaps, but the sugar is also a problem. Why you put sugar in meat? Balances the salt, helps with the cure, adds a nice caramelization when it cooks. Roy paused, seeing Heinrich's incomprehension. You really don't do sweet and savory together much in Germany, do you? Not like this. We have sweet foods and we have meat. They do not mix. This cultural gulf fascinated Roy more than it frustrated him. He'd spent 20 years cooking army food, had served in the Philippines before the war, and learned to adapt recipes to local tastes. This was just another variation of the same challenge. All right, tell you what. I'll do a test batch. Half salt cure, no sugar. Trim the fat before cooking. Cook it longer, get it crispier. We'll try it on your barracks first, see what the reaction is. Heinrich nodded, appreciating the willingness to experiment. As they walked through the kitchen, Roy pointed out other ingredients, asking questions about German preferences. Did they like their eggs runny or firm? What vegetables were common? How was coffee prepared? Heinrich answered as best he could, though he wasn't a chef, and his knowledge was limited to what his mother and the Wehrmacht mess halls had served. Bobby Jenkins, standing guard by the door, watched the exchange with interest. He'd never seen two people bond over food preparation before, never realized how much care went into feeding 3,000 men 3 times a day. Roy worked with the focused intensity of someone who took professional pride in his craft, and Bobby respected that, recognized it as similar to his father's approach to farming. Do the work right, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. As Heinrich prepared to leave, Roy called after him. "Hey, one more thing. You got anyone in your barracks who knows how to bake? Real baking, I mean, bread from scratch." Heinrich thought for a moment. "Gerhard Müller from Bremen. His family owned a bakery. He talks about it sometimes. Think he'd be willing to help me figure out this black bread you fellows want? I can make rye, but I don't know the technique for getting it as dense as you're describing." The request surprised Heinrich. Roy wasn't just accommodating preferences, he was actively seeking expertise from the prisoners, treating them as collaborators rather than recipients of charity. "I will ask him," Heinrich promised. That evening, Heinrich approached Gerhard, a quiet man in his 40s, who'd been conscripted late in the war and captured almost immediately during the Tunisia campaign. Gerhard listened to the proposal with skeptical interest. "They want me to teach them to make proper German bread." "He does, yes, the cook, Sergeant Duplantis." Gerhard was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. They were baker's hands, thick-fingered and strong, currently useless in captivity. "I have not baked since 1942, he said softly, "before I was called up. Sometimes I dream about the bakery, about the smell of bread in the morning. Then I wake up here. This is a chance to bake again," Heinrich pointed out. "Even if it is not your bakery. Working with the Americans, some will say it is collaboration. Some already say that about me. Let them talk. At least we will eat better." Gerhard smiled slightly, the first time Heinrich had seen the older man show any happiness. "My father always said that bread was the foundation of civilization, that any society that could not make good bread was not worth living in." Maybe he was right. Maybe teaching Americans to bake properly is more important than politics. 3 days later, Gerhard stood in Roy's kitchen, examining the industrial mixers and ovens with a professional eye. Through Heinrich's translation, he explained the process for creating authentic German Schwarzbrot. The dough needed to be very firm, almost stiff, with a mixture of rye flour, wheat flour, and whole grains. The key was the long, slow baking at lower temperature, which created the dense texture and dark crust that characterized proper German bread. Roy took notes, asked questions, adjusted his approach. He didn't have all the traditional ingredients, couldn't source the exact type of rye flour Gerhard preferred, but he was willing to experiment. They spent an entire afternoon working together, Gerhard's hands moving with remembered precision as he shaped test loaves, Roy watching carefully and replicating the techniques. The first batch emerged from the ovens that evening, dark and aromatic. Gerhard cut into one loaf, examining the crumb structure critically. It wasn't perfect, wasn't quite right, but it was closer to authentic German bread than anything he'd seen since leaving Europe. He nodded slowly. "This will do. With practice, it will get better." Roy grinned, pleased with himself. "We'll add it to tomorrow's breakfast. Give your friends something to talk about besides bacon." Word spread through the prisoner barracks that night. The baker from Bremen had taught the Americans to make real bread. Some prisoners viewed this as a small victory, proof that their culture and preferences mattered. Others, particularly among the more rigid nationalists, saw it as evidence of dangerous accommodation, of forgetting who they were and what they'd fought for. But when breakfast was served the next morning, when the prisoners saw actual dark bread with a proper crust alongside the modified bacon and eggs, even the skeptics took portions. Heinrich watched as men ate in silence, some with tears in their eyes. It was just bread, just flour and water and salt and thyme, but it was also a connection to home, a reminder that they were still German despite everything that had happened. Klaus Hoffmann ate 3 slices, then sought out Heinrich afterward. "This was good," Klaus admitted. "A good thing you did, arranging this. Gerhard did it, not me. You are the bridge. Without you, this does not happen." Klaus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was wrong to doubt. Sometimes accommodation is not surrender. Sometimes it is just survival with dignity." The summer of 1944 rolled on, hot and relentless. The prisoners worked in labor details, helping local farmers with harvest, maintaining the camp infrastructure, earning a few cents per day in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen. The work was hard but not cruel, nothing like the forced labor they'd heard about in other theaters of war. The farmers treated them decently, often sharing water and occasionally sneaking them extra food, curious about these Germans who'd ended up in the middle of Kansas. Heinrich worked on a wheat farm owned by a family named Patterson, no relation to Sergeant Patterson. John Patterson was a weathered man in his 60s whose 2 sons were serving in the Pacific. He spoke little, worked hard, and expected the same from the German prisoners assigned to his farm. But he was fair, never raised his voice, and when the day's work was done, his wife Margaret often brought out lemonade and cookies, serving the prisoners the same as she would any farmhand. One afternoon, as they took a break in the shade of a barn, John sat beside Heinrich and pulled out a pipe. "You speak English pretty good," he observed. "I am learning," Heinrich replied. "Where you from? In Germany, I mean." "Stuttgart, in the south." John nodded, packing tobacco into his pipe. "Never been to Europe. Always figured I'd see it someday, but not like this. Not with my boys over there fighting." He lit the pipe, drew on it thoughtfully. "You got family back home?" "My mother. My father died when I was 12. "She know you're alive?" "I hope so. I have written letters, but I do not know if they reach her." "Red Cross is supposed to handle that," John said. "Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. War makes everything complicated." He smoked in silence for a moment. "My youngest boy, Tommy, he's your age, 22, Marine Corps, somewhere in the Pacific. We get letters every few weeks when the mail catches up. He says the Japanese fight hard, don't surrender. Says it's hell over there." Heinrich understood what John wasn't quite saying, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were on opposite sides of the same terrible conflict. "I am sorry," he offered, inadequate but genuine. "Yeah, well, you didn't start it, did you? Just got caught up in it, same as Tommy." John stood, stretching his back. "Break's over. Let's get back to it." As they worked through the afternoon, cutting and bundling wheat under the blazing sun, Heinrich reflected on the strange nature of his captivity. He was a prisoner, technically an enemy, yet he was being treated with more basic human decency than he'd experienced in much of his Wehrmacht service. The Americans fed him, paid him for his work, allowed him to maintain some sense of dignity and purpose. It was disorienting, this kindness from people who had every right to hate him. That evening, back at camp, he tried to explain this to Klaus, who listened with his usual skeptical expression. "They are buying us," Klaus said flatly, "making us grateful, making us forget who we are. It is a strategy." "Maybe. Or maybe they are just decent people." "Decent people do not bomb cities full of civilians. Do not destroy entire nations. The Americans are at war, same as we were. They are not saints." Heinrich couldn't argue with that logic. He'd seen enough of war to know that no side had a monopoly on virtue or vice, but there were gradations, degrees of humanity that persisted even in inhumane circumstances. The Americans at Camp Concordia, from Colonel Morrison down to privates like Bobby Jenkins, had chosen to treat their prisoners as human beings rather than subhuman enemies. That choice mattered, even if larger strategies and policies remained brutal. As autumn approached, bringing relief from the summer heat, changes began rippling through the camp. New prisoners arrived weekly, captured during the liberation of France and the Allied push toward Germany. These men brought fresh news, fresh perspectives and fresh tensions. Some were relieved to be out of combat, grateful for 3 meals and relative safety. Others were bitter, angry, humiliated by defeat and captivity. The camp's population dynamics grew more complex, more fractious. One new arrival, a young corporal named Stefan from Bavaria, sought out Heinrich after hearing about the food arrangements. Stefan was barely 20, with a baby face and nervous energy. He'd been captured near Paris after his unit had been overrun during the breakout from Normandy. "Is it true," Stefan asked, "about the bacon, that they make it special for us?" "They make modifications, yes," Heinrich confirmed, "to make it more acceptable." Stefan's eyes widened. "But that is amazing. In the camp where I was before, in England, they gave us terrible food. Boiled everything until it was grey. No taste, no care. We complained and they said we were lucky to eat at all." This perspective reminded Heinrich how fortunate they were at Concordia, how the specific combination of reasonable officers and willing cooperation had created something unusual. Not all camps operated this way. Not all prisoners had bridges built for them. "Here we have been lucky," Heinrich said. "We have people willing to listen." "Can I help?" Stefan asked eagerly. "I worked in a restaurant before the war. I know food, know cooking. Maybe I can help with other things." Heinrich brought Stefan to Roy's attention, and within a week, the young Bavarian was working regularly in the kitchen, learning American techniques while sharing German recipes. Stefan had an enthusiasm that some of the older prisoners lacked, a willingness to embrace new experiences that came from youth and adaptability. He and Bobby Jenkins became unlikely friends, communicating through a mixture of broken English, worse German, and hand gestures, laughing at their mutual incompetence while somehow getting work done. The kitchen became a strange hybrid space, neither fully American nor fully German, but something in between. Roy incorporated techniques Gerhard taught him, used spices Stefan suggested, created fusion dishes that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Some experiments failed spectacularly, like the day Roy tried to make sauerbraten and produce something that tasted like vinegar-soaked shoe leather. Others succeeded beyond expectation, like a potato dish that combined American and German approaches into something both groups enjoyed. Thomas Patterson watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. His superiors were pleased with Concordia's low incident rate, its efficient operation, its positive reputation. Other camp commanders were asking for advice, wanting to know how Patterson maintained such good order. He always gave credit to his men and to the prisoners themselves, emphasizing that respect and accommodation produced better results than punishment and rigid enforcement. Bobby became Heinrich's primary contact, meeting with him in the mess hall during off hours to discuss possibilities. The farm boy from Iowa and the soldier from Stuttgart discovered they could communicate more than either had expected, filling gaps in vocabulary with gestures and drawings. Bobby brought in the head cook, a portly master sergeant from Louisiana named Roy Duplantis, who listened to Heinrich's descriptions with professional interest. These meetings became regular occurrences, scheduled twice weekly in the mess hall after the evening meal had been cleared. Bobby would bring coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory blend the prisoners sometimes received, and they would sit at one of the long tables with Roy's recipe notebook spread between them. Heinrich found himself looking forward to these sessions, the practical problem-solving, a welcome distraction from the existential questions of captivity and uncertain future. During one such meeting, Bobby pulled out a letter from his mother, who'd enclosed a recipe for her famous Sunday bacon. "Ma heard I was working with German prisoners," Bobby explained, his cheeks reddening slightly. "She wanted to help. Said maybe if I understood how she makes bacon, I could explain it better to you fellows." Heinrich read through the recipe, which was written in flowing cursive on flowered stationery. The instructions were detailed, loving even, describing not just the mechanical process, but the traditions surrounding it. Sunday bacon in the Jenkins household was apparently a ritual, connected to church and family, and weekly rhythms that had persisted for generations. He looked up at Bobby with new understanding. For your family, this bacon is important, is not just food. Yeah, exactly. It's part of who we are. Sunday morning, after church, the whole family gathers. Ma makes bacon and eggs and biscuits, and we all sit together. Has been that way since I was little, probably before I was born even. Bobby smiled at the memory. When I smell bacon cooking, I think of home. Think of Ma and Pa and my sisters. Think of everything being normal and safe. This is what I tried to explain before, Heinrich said quietly. Food is identity. When you gave us your bacon, you were sharing something important to you, but we could not receive it because it was too strange, too foreign. We felt like we were losing ourselves. Roy leaned forward, his professional interest engaged. So, what we've been doing, adapting the recipes, it's not just about taste, it's about letting you keep being German while you're stuck here being prisoners. Yes, exactly this. Well, hell, Roy said, sitting back. If I'd known it was that important, I'd have started modifying things from day one, could have saved everyone a lot of trouble and a lot of wasted food. He made a note in his notebook. What else are we getting wrong? What else makes you feel like you're losing yourselves? This question opened new territories of discussion. Heinrich explained that meal timing was different in Germany, that the main meal was typically at midday rather than evening. That coffee was served differently, stronger, and in smaller portions. That certain vegetables like cabbage and turnips featured prominently in German cuisine, but were rarely seen in the American menu. Each point revealed another layer of cultural distinction, another way that everyday life differed between nations. Bobby listened, fascinated. He'd never considered that there might be different philosophies behind something as basic as when to eat dinner. In Iowa, supper was the main meal, eaten after the day's work was done, when the family could gather. The idea that Germans ate their largest meal at noon seemed impractical until Heinrich explained that many workers went home for the midday break, that the rhythm of European life allowed for this pattern. Can't change the meal schedule, Roy said apologetically. That's set by army regulations, not up to me, but maybe we can do something about the portions, make lunch heartier and dinner lighter, if that would feel more normal to you fellows. These were small accommodations, tiny adjustments to institutional routines, but their cumulative effect was significant. The prisoners began to feel less like they were being processed and more like they were being considered. Even men like Klaus, who remained skeptical of cooperation, had to acknowledge that conditions were improving, that the Americans were making genuine efforts to respect German preferences within the constraints of military regulations and available resources. One afternoon, Roy invited Heinrich to witness the bacon preparation process from start to finish. They walked to the smokehouse, a converted storage building behind the main kitchen, where sides of pork hung on hooks like strange fruit. The smell was intense, a combination of wood smoke, salt and curing meat that made Heinrich's stomach clench with hunger despite the recent lunch. Roy explained each step: the initial salt rub, the week-long cure, the smoking process using hickory wood from a grove near the camp. He showed Heinrich how they'd modified the process for the German prisoners, using less sugar in the cure, trimming more fat, smoking for a longer period to develop deeper flavor. The care and precision involved surprised Heinrich, challenged his assumptions about American carelessness and excess. You take this very seriously, Heinrich observed. Course I do. Feeding people is serious business. Done right, a good meal can lift spirits, give people strength to face another day. Done wrong, it's just fuel, no better than coal in an engine. Roy patted one of the hanging sides of pork affectionately. These pigs gave their lives to feed you fellows. Least I can do is make sure they're prepared properly, with respect. This philosophy resonated with Heinrich in unexpected ways. In the Wehrmacht, particularly in the later years as resources dwindled, food had become purely functional, calories to keep soldiers moving. The idea that meals could be more than sustenance, could be an expression of care and cultural identity, had been lost somewhere in the grinding machinery of total war. Roy's approach reminded him that civilization persisted in small gestures, in the choice to do things well, even when merely adequate would suffice. As they walked back to the main kitchen, Heinrich asked, "Why do you care so much? We are prisoners, enemies. You could give us anything and we would have to eat it." Roy stopped walking, turned to face Heinrich directly. "Let me tell you something about my philosophy. I'm from Louisiana, down in Cajun country. My grandparents came over from France, settled in the bayou, lived poor but dignified. They taught me that food is love made visible, that how you feed people tells them what you think they're worth. Now, you fellows might be prisoners, might have fought for Hitler and all that evil, but you're still human beings, still deserve to be fed like human beings." He paused. "Besides, my boy is over in Europe somewhere, paratrooper, jumped on D-Day. I got to believe that if he gets captured, some German cook is going to feed him decent, going to treat him like he matters. I feed you the way I hope someone's feeding my son." The raw honesty of this statement hit Heinrich like a physical blow. He'd thought of the Americans as faceless representatives of enemy power, not as individuals with sons at risk, with personal stakes in how prisoners were treated. Roy's kindness wasn't strategic or calculated, it was deeply personal, rooted in a parent's fear and hope. "Your son," Heinrich said carefully, "I hope he is safe. I hope someone is taking care of him." "Yeah, me too." Roy cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "Come on, let's get back. Got 3,000 mouths to feed for dinner." That evening, Heinrich shared this conversation with Klaus and several others from his barracks. The revelation that Roy's generosity came from paternal concern rather than institutional policy shifted something in the room's atmosphere. These weren't abstract enemies following orders, they were individuals making choices, driven by the same fears and hopes that motivated Germans. "This changes nothing," Klaus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "His son fights against our countrymen. We are still on opposite sides." "Are we?" Wolfgang challenged. "The war continues in Europe, yes. But here, what are we fighting for here? Pride? The memory of battles already lost? Or are we just trying to survive until we can go home?" It was a question that haunted all of them. The tension between loyalty to cause and acceptance of reality. Germany was losing. Everyone knew that, even if they couldn't admit it aloud. The tide had turned on every front, and the question was no longer if Germany would be defeated, but when and at what final cost. Maintaining rigid resistance to American overtures wouldn't change that outcome, would only make their captivity harder and more miserable. Over the following weeks, as summer deepened into August and news from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany, more prisoners began to participate in the cultural exchange happening in the kitchen. Men who'd worked as butchers or bakers or cooks in civilian life volunteered their expertise, teaching Roy and his staff techniques and recipes they'd learned in Düsseldorf or Munich or Hamburg. The mess hall began serving hybrid meals that honored both traditions, finding common ground between American abundance and German precision. "So you want the bacon less fatty," Roy said, making notes on a pad. "Less sweet, crisper. That's not hard. We've been using the regular cure, which has sugar in it. I can switch to a salt cure for your portions, cook it longer, render out more fat. Won't taste exactly like your German bacon, but it'll be closer." Heinrich translated this to a group of prisoners who'd gathered to listen, their faces skeptical but interested. Wolfgang raised a hand. "What about bread? Can they make proper bread? Dark bread? With seeds? Not this white?" This white nothing? Bobby looked to Roy, who shrugged. I can do rye. Got the flour for it. Be dense, probably too dense for American tastes, but if that's what you want, sure. And sausage, Klaus added, his tone challenging. Real sausage, not hot dogs. Now that's trickier, Roy admitted. But I can probably make something. What kind of sausage you talking about? Heinrich found himself translating increasingly detailed culinary discussions, a surreal experience given that 6 months ago he'd been fighting these people. But there was something almost therapeutic about focusing on food, on the concrete and achievable, rather than dwelling on the war and everything that had led them here. The Americans seemed genuinely willing to accommodate within their limitations, and that willingness meant something. The first test came 2 weeks later. Roy had prepared a modified breakfast, keeping some American elements, but adjusting the bacon and adding rye bread. The prisoners approached the serving line with cautious curiosity, unsure what to expect. Heinrich was among the first, and he saw immediately that the bacon looked different, darker and much crisper, with far less visible fat. He took his portion and sat with Klaus and Wolfgang, all three of them examining the modified meal. Well, Klaus said, try it. Heinrich cut a piece of bacon and ate it slowly, analyzing the taste. It was still sweeter than German bacon, still distinctly American, but the overwhelming greasiness was gone. The salt cure Roy had used came closer to the flavor profile he remembered, and the extra cooking had given it a texture that was actually pleasant, crispy without being burnt. It wasn't home, but it wasn't offensive either. Better, he said simply. Wolfgang tried his own piece and nodded. Much better. I could eat this. Nay, around the mess hall, similar conversations were happening as prisoners worked through the modified breakfast. The rye bread was too light compared to German Schwarzbrot, but it had the right color, and the seeds provided familiar texture. Most men ate everything on their trays, some even returning for seconds. The change in atmosphere was palpable, tension easing as hunger was satisfied without the accompanying sense of violation. Bobby watched from the serving line, grinning so wide his face hurt. When Heinrich came back for more coffee, Bobby caught his attention. So, how'd we do? Is good. Not perfect, but good. Heinrich allowed himself a small smile. You kept your word. Course I did. We'll keep working on it too. Roy's got some ideas for dinner. He thinks he can make something like what you call Rheinswurst. Over the following months, the mess hall became an unexpected site of cultural exchange. Roy experimented with recipes, consulting with Heinrich and other prisoners who'd worked in food preparation before the war. He learned to make versions of Kartoffelsalat and Rotkohl, adapted traditional dishes using available ingredients. The bacon remained a compromise, neither fully American nor fully German, but acceptable to both sides. Some prisoners still refused it on principle, but the vast majority ate willingly, and waste dropped to almost nothing. Thomas Patterson reported these successes up the chain of command, where they were received with mixed reactions. Some officers viewed the accommodations as coddling the enemy, but Colonel Morrison, a practical man who cared more about results than ideology, saw only that his camp was running more smoothly, fewer conflicts, better morale, healthier prisoners who could work the farm labor programs that helped support the camp and the surrounding community. If bacon preparation was the key to that success, so be it. But the food was only part of a larger transformation happening at Concordia. As Heinrich spent more time working with Bobby and the kitchen staff, he found his perspective shifting in ways he'd never anticipated. The Americans weren't what he'd been taught to expect. They weren't weak or decadent or racially inferior, just different. They came from different backgrounds, believed different things, ate different food. But underneath those differences, they were fundamentally similar to the Germans in the ways that mattered. They missed their homes. They worried about their families. They wanted the war to end so they could return to normal lives. Bobby, for his part, was learning that the enemy could be humanized without being excused. Heinrich told him stories about Stuttgart before the war, about studying architecture at university, about wanting to design buildings that would stand for centuries. He'd joined the Wehrmacht out of duty, he said, not fanaticism, and while Bobby wasn't sure he fully believed this, he understood that the truth was probably complicated. Not everyone who fought for Germany was a monster, just as not everyone who fought for America was a hero. They were all caught up in something bigger than themselves, making choices within limited options. One evening in late autumn, as the Kansas prairie turned gold and brown and the first cold winds promised winter, Heinrich and Bobby sat in the empty mess hall after dinner cleanup. They'd fallen into a habit of these conversations, unofficial and technically against regulations, but tolerated by Thomas Patterson, who understood the value of the relationship. Bobby was teaching Heinrich better English, and Heinrich was teaching Bobby basic German, though Bobby's accent made the other prisoners laugh. "Can I ask you something?" Bobby said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Do you think Germany will win the war?" It was a dangerous question, one that could be interpreted as seeking military intelligence, but by now they both understood these conversations existed outside normal protocols. Heinrich considered his answer carefully. "No," he said finally. "I do not think so. Not anymore. Did you ever?" "Once. In the beginning, yes. We won so quickly, so easily. France fell in weeks. It seemed impossible to stop. But now—" He trailed off, looking out the window toward the darkening sky. "America is too large, too rich, too many people. Germany cannot defeat this. I have seen it here in this camp. You have everything: food, resources, space. You can afford to treat prisoners well because you have more than enough for yourselves. Germany does not have this luxury. That make you angry, knowing that?" "Angry?" Heinrich thought about it. "No, maybe sad. So many people dying for something that cannot be won. But not angry. Anger requires energy, and I have none left for that." Bobby nodded, understanding. "What'll you do after, when the war ends?" "If I survive, I go home. If there is still a home to go to. And I will build buildings. Design them, build them, make something that creates instead of destroys." He smiled slightly. "Maybe I will design a kitchen, a very good kitchen where German and American food can both be prepared properly." Bobby laughed. "That'd be something. Hey, you ever thought about staying here? In America, I mean, after?" The question caught Heinrich off guard. Stay in America. The idea had never occurred to him, seemed impossible and vaguely traitorous. But as he thought about it, sitting in this mess hall, in this strange flat land where people had treated him with more dignity than he'd expected, he couldn't entirely dismiss it. Not as a plan, but as a possibility. A door that might be open someday if he chose to walk through it. "I do not know," he said honestly. "It's too much to think about now." The winter of 1944 into 45 was particularly harsh on the plains. Snow fell in heavy blankets, wind howling across empty fields, temperatures dropping far below anything Heinrich had experienced in Stuttgart. The barracks were heated but never quite warm enough, and the prisoners huddled in layers of wool and whatever else they could scrounge. But the food remained good, remained consistent, and that made a difference that was hard to quantify. Well-fed men tolerated the cold better, fought sickness more effectively, maintained hope more easily. In January, news filtered into the camp about the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, and its failure. The prisoners received this information with varying reactions. Some refused to believe it, insisted it was Allied propaganda. Others, like Heinrich, recognized it for what it was, the death rattle of a dying regime. Klaus Hoffmann, ever the pessimist, predicted that Germany would fight to the last man, that Hitler would never surrender, would burn the country to ash before admitting defeat. Heinrich hoped he was wrong, but suspected he wasn't. As winter turned to spring, the camp population shifted. New prisoners arrived from the European theatre as Germany's collapse accelerated. These men were different from the Afrika Korps veterans, harder and more fanatical, some bearing the lightning bolt insignia of the SS. They brought with them stories of devastation, of entire armies destroyed, of cities in ruins. They also brought a resistance to accommodation that threatened the fragile peace Thomas Patterson and his team had built. One morning in early April, a fight broke out in the mess hall. Heinrich watched it unfold from across the room, saw one of the new arrivals, a stern-faced Unterscharführer named Beck, knock a tray from Wolfgang's hands, sending eggs and bacon scattering across the floor. Beck was shouting something about collaboration, about betraying the fatherland by accepting enemy charity. Several of his companions surrounded Wolfgang, who stood his ground despite being outnumbered. Heinrich moved without thinking, crossing the hall and inserting himself between Wolfgang and Beck. "Enough," he said in German. "This accomplishes nothing." Beck's eyes were cold, evaluating. "You're the one who works with them, the Americans' pet. I've heard about you, Bauer, trading your honor for better food. I'm trying to survive. We all are. Fighting each other doesn't change anything." "Survival." Beck spat the word. "While our brothers die in the fatherland, you sit here eating bacon and learning English. You make me sick." American guards were converging now, Billy Jenkins among them, sensing trouble. Heinrich saw Bobby's hand move to his sidearm, saw the tension ratcheting up. One wrong move, and this could turn into something that would undo months of careful relationship building. "Stand down," Heinrich said, meeting Beck's eyes. "You want to fight? Fight the guards. See how that works out for you. Or you can eat breakfast and wait for the war to end like the rest of us." For a long moment nobody moved. Then Beck stepped back, though his expression remained contemptuous. "This isn't over," he said quietly. The guards separated everyone, and the meal continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The fracture lines in the prisoner population, always present but usually manageable, had become visible and sharp. Thomas Patterson called Heinrich to his office that afternoon. "Tell me about Beck," Thomas said without preamble. Heinrich sat across the desk, choosing his words carefully. "He is SS. True believer. He and men like him, they do not accept what is happening. They think we betray Germany by accepting your hospitality." "Is he dangerous?" "Maybe. To other prisoners more than to you. But he could cause problems, yes." Thomas nodded slowly. "We've been lucky here at Concordia. No major incidents, no escape attempts, nothing the brass could use to shut us down. But if Beck and his friends start making trouble, if they convince others to stop cooperating—" He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. They both understood that the accommodations, the cultural compromises, everything they'd built could disappear overnight if the camp became unmanageable. "What do you want me to do?" Heinrich asked. "Keep an eye on him. Report to me if you hear anything concerning. And for God's sake, stay safe. Last thing we need is you getting hurt because some hardliner decides you're a traitor." Heinrich left the office with a knot in his stomach, aware that his position had become more precarious. He'd never sought to be a liaison, never wanted to be caught between two worlds, but circumstances had placed him there, and now he had to navigate it as best he could. That evening, he found Klaus Hoffmann in the barracks and told him what had happened. Klaus listened, his thin face troubled. "Beck is not wrong about everything," he said carefully. "We have become comfortable here. Maybe too comfortable. We forget we are prisoners. You want to go back to starving? To fighting with the guards? No. But I also do not want to lose myself completely. When this is over, when we go home, who will we be? Germans who learned to love American bacon." He shook his head. is not a simple question. Heinrich understood. The question of identity, of what it meant to be German in a context stripped of nation and cause, haunted all of them. The food, the language lessons, the small kindnesses from guards like Bobby Jenkins, all of it was seductive because it was easier than maintaining rigid resistance. But easier didn't always mean right. In early May, the war in Europe ended. The news came over the camp loudspeakers on a bright spring morning, and for a moment, everything stopped. The prisoners stood frozen, processing what they'd known was coming, but had refused to fully accept. Germany had surrendered. It was over. They had lost. Heinrich found Bobby outside the mess hall, sitting on a bench and staring at nothing. The young American looked up when Heinrich approached, his expression complicated. "It's done," Bobby said. "Your war's over." "Yes. What happens now?" Heinrich sat beside him. "We wait, I suppose. Wait to learn what peace looks like. Wait to find out if we still have homes to return to." They sat in silence for a while, two young men who'd been enemies and had become something else, something neither of them quite had words for. Finally, Bobby spoke again. "I'm glad you're alive, Heinrich. Glad you ended up here instead of somewhere worse." "Me too," Heinrich admitted. "You gave me bacon, and I thought it was garbage. But you kept trying. That meant something." Bobby laughed, though his eyes were wet. "We did change the recipe pretty good, though, didn't we?" "Yes, you did." The camp didn't close immediately. Repatriation would take months, perhaps longer, as the Allies worked through the logistics of returning millions of prisoners and displaced persons. Life at Concordia continued in a strange limbo, the urgency gone but the routine remaining. Roy Duplantis kept cooking his hybrid meals, and the prisoners kept eating them. Though the dining hall was quieter now, everyone lost in thoughts of what came next. Beck and his faction caused trouble sporadically, trying to enforce their own version of discipline and loyalty, but their influence waned as the reality of defeat sank in. Most prisoners had no energy left for ideology, wanted only to survive long enough to get home. Heinrich avoided confrontation when possible, but his role as informal liaison had marked him, and Beck's cold stares promised future reckoning if circumstances ever shifted. In June, Thomas Patterson pulled Heinrich aside with news. "You're being transferred," Thomas said. "There's a camp in Texas near Austin that needs someone who speaks English and understands how to work with prisoner populations. They want you there to help set up programs similar to what we've done here." Heinrich felt a complex mix of emotions: relief at leaving before Beck's resentment turned violent, sadness at abandoning the unlikely friendships he'd built, uncertainty about starting over in yet another alien place. "When do I leave?" 3 days. I recommended you for this, Heinrich. I hope that's okay, but what we accomplished here, it's worth replicating. Other camps are having problems we solved months ago. You could help fix that. I'm a prisoner, Sergeant, not your employee. I know what you are, but I also know who you are, and that matters more. Thomas extended his hand. You're a good man caught up in bad circumstances. If I can use that to make things better for other prisoners, I will. Heinrich shook the offered hand, German reserve cracking slightly. Thank you. For everything. You did not have to treat us well. Yes, I did. That's what being decent requires. Win, lose, or draw, you don't lose your humanity. That's the only thing that separates us from the worst of what this war brought out. Bobby drove Heinrich to the train station on the day of his departure, both of them quiet in the truck. When they arrived, Bobby helped carry Heinrich's small bag of possessions to the platform. The train that would take Heinrich south was already there, steam hissing from its engine. I never learned much German, Bobby said, trying to lighten the mood. Still can barely count to 10. And my English is still terrible, Heinrich replied, though they both knew it had improved dramatically. Maybe that's okay. Maybe we weren't supposed to understand everything. Maybe just trying was enough. Bobby pulled something from his pocket, a small paper bag. Here, for the trip. Heinrich opened it and found bacon, wrapped carefully, cooked exactly the way Roy had learned to make it, the compromise preparation that was neither fully American nor fully German, but somehow worked for both. He looked up at Bobby, surprised to find his eyes burning. "It's still weird," Bobby said, smiling. "But you'll eat it now, right?" "Yes," Heinrich said. "I will eat it." They shook hands one final time and Heinrich boarded the train. As it pulled away from the station, he looked back and saw Bobby standing on the platform, one hand raised in farewell. Heinrich waved back, then found a seat by the window and watched Kansas disappear behind him, flat and endless and strangely beautiful in the summer light. He opened the bag and ate a piece of the bacon slowly, tasting all the layers of compromise it represented. Not perfect, not home, but sustenance, offered with respect, accepted with dignity. In a world that had known too much of hatred and destruction, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was even something worth remembering. The train carried him south toward Texas, toward another camp, and another uncertain chapter. But Heinrich Bauer, who had once spat out American bacon as kitchen trash, ate every piece Bobby had given him and found himself thinking not about the war that had ended, but about the peace that might be possible when people chose to meet each other halfway, even over something as simple as breakfast. Texas greeted him with heat more oppressive than anything Kansas had offered, a wall of humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. Camp Swift, located outside Austin, was larger than Concordia, housing over 5,000 prisoners in sprawling barracks that stretched across former ranch land. The landscape was different too. Rolling hills dotted with scrub oak instead of endless flat prairie, a harder country that felt less forgiving. The camp commander, Colonel Hartwick, was a stern West Point graduate who ran operations with military precision. He'd requested Heinrich specifically after reading Thomas Patterson's reports, wanted someone who could help implement similar food programs and reduce the waste and tension that plagued many POW camps. But Hartwick made it clear from their first meeting that he expected results, not friendship. "You'll work with our head cook, Master Sergeant Coleman," Hartwick said, his office fan doing little to move the sluggish air. "You'll identify problems, propose solutions, and help implement them. You'll report to Sergeant First Class Martinez, who oversees prisoner services. You'll have no direct contact with American personnel outside these assignments. You'll maintain proper military bearing at all times. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Heinrich responded, the formality feeling strange after the relatively relaxed atmosphere of Concordia. "One more thing, Bauer. I don't care what worked in Kansas. This is Texas, and we do things our way. You advise, but command makes decisions. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Master Sergeant Coleman turned out to be a taciturn black man from Georgia with 30 years of Army cooking experience and little patience for what he called coddling prisoners. Their first meeting was tense, Coleman making clear that he considered Heinrich's presence an insult to his professional competence. "I've been feeding soldiers since before you were born," Coleman said, his voice flat and controlled. "Don't need some German prisoner telling me how to do my job." Heinrich chose his words carefully, aware that one misstep could doom any chance of cooperation. "I am not here to criticize your cooking, Sergeant, only to explain why German prisoners respond differently to American food and perhaps find solutions that work for everyone. German prisoners complain too much. That's the solution. Stop complaining, eat what's served, be grateful you're not starving in some Russian camp." It was hard to argue with that logic. Heinrich had heard stories about German prisoners in Soviet hands, the brutal conditions and high mortality rates. Compared to that, any American camp was paradise. but he thought of Roy Duplantis, of the philosophy that feeding people well was about dignity, not just survival, and tried another approach. "May I ask a question, Sergeant?" Coleman gestured impatiently. "Go ahead. Do you enjoy your work? The cooking, I mean." No, the question clearly surprised Coleman. He paused, considering. What kind of question is that? An honest one. "Do you take pride in feeding people well?" "Course I do. Wouldn't still be doing it after 30 years if I didn't." "Then perhaps you understand. For us, for German prisoners, the food you serve is technically adequate, but it does not feed our spirit, only our stomach. And when spirit is hungry, the body cannot be satisfied no matter how much it eats." Coleman stared at Heinrich for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he said, "You're more articulate than I expected. Most prisoners I deal with can barely manage please and thank you in English. I studied languages before the war, and I have had time to practice." "All right, college boy. You want to help? Then help. But don't waste my time with theory. Show me practical solutions that work within my budget and army regulations, or we're done." Over the following weeks, Heinrich worked to earn Coleman's trust and respect. It was harder than at Concordia, where Roy's natural warmth and Bobby's friendliness had created openings for connection. Coleman remained distant, professional, skeptical of every suggestion. But he was fair, and he was willing to test ideas that made practical sense. The bacon issue at Camp Swift was even more pronounced than it had been at Concordia. The prisoners were throwing away nearly 60% of their breakfast meat, a waste that bothered Coleman, despite his gruff exterior. Heinrich worked with him to implement the modified preparation technique Roy had developed, adjusting it for Camp Swift's larger scale and different equipment. The first test batch produced acceptable results, though not as good as Roy's version. Coleman's approach was more by the book, less intuitive, but it worked well enough. When waste dropped by 30% after the first week, Coleman grudgingly acknowledged the success. "Not bad," he said, which Heinrich learned was high praise from the Georgia cook. "What else you got?" They tackled bread next, then coffee preparation, then the timing and composition of meals. Each small victory built on the last, and gradually Coleman warmed to the process, if not to Heinrich personally. The sergeant shared his own observations about prisoner behavior, pointed out patterns Heinrich had missed, contributed ideas that improved their solutions. One evening, as they worked late in the kitchen preparing for the next day, Coleman spoke more openly than he had before. "You know why I resisted this at first? Having you here, I mean?" Heinrich, who'd been measuring flour, looked up. "Because you saw it as criticism of your work?" "Partly, but mostly because I didn't want to care." Coleman leaned against a counter, his face lined with fatigue. "I've spent this whole war cooking for soldiers who might die tomorrow, feeding boys who look at me and see nothing but a uniform and a serving spoon. If I let myself think of them as people, if I let myself care whether they enjoy their food or just choke it down, then I'm carrying their weight along with my own. And I'm too damn old to carry more weight." The admission surprised Heinrich with its vulnerability. "But you do care. I have seen it in your work." "Yeah, I do. Can't help it. 30 years of feeding people, you either care or you quit. No middle ground." Coleman sighed. "Having you here, working on making food better for prisoners, it reminds me that everyone at this table is somebody's son. Whether they wear our uniform or yours doesn't change that basic truth. Your philosophy is not so different from Sergeant Duplantis in Kansas. He said similar things. And I never met the man, but I respect anyone who takes feeding people seriously." Coleman straightened, returning to his usual businesslike manner. "Come on, let's finish this prep. Got 5,000 hungry Germans to feed tomorrow, and they're going to eat everything we give them, whether they like it or not. But they did like it, or at least tolerated it better than before." As the modifications spread through the menu, as more German techniques were incorporated and more American dishes were adapted, the atmosphere in the mess hall shifted. Prisoners ate with less resentment, waste decreased, tensions eased. Colonel Hartwick, noting these improvements in his reports, began to see Heinrich as an asset rather than an experiment. The autumn of 1945 brought news that made everyone in camp stop and reckon with reality. The Nuremberg trials had begun, broadcasting to the world the full extent of Nazi atrocities. The concentration camps, the systematic murder, the industrial-scale genocide that many German soldiers had claimed to know nothing about, all of it was now undeniable, documented in horrifying detail. In the barracks at night, prisoners argued in hushed voices about what they'd known, what they'd suspected, what they'd willfully ignored. Some refused to believe the reports, insisted it was propaganda exaggeration. Others admitted to knowledge they'd suppressed, to rumors they'd dismissed, to evidence they'd chosen not to see. The collective reckoning was painful, fractured, and incomplete. Heinrich found himself wrestling with his own complicity and denial. He'd known that something terrible was happening to Jews, to other undesirables the regime had targeted. Everyone had known that much, even if details were scarce. But he'd told himself it wasn't his concern, that as a soldier, his duty was to fight enemy armies, not question government policy. Now that willful ignorance felt like cowardice, like moral failure. Bobby had written to him, letters passing through the camp mail system with irregular frequency. In one letter, Bobby asked directly, "Did you know? Did German soldiers know what was being done in their name?" Heinrich sat for days, trying to answer honestly, finally writing back, "We knew something. Not everything, but something. We chose not to ask questions because we feared the answers. That choice haunts me now and will haunt me for whatever life I have remaining." Bobby's response came weeks later. "I don't know how to forgive something that big. I don't think I can. But I also know that you're not the same as the people who did those things, or at least you don't have to be. What matters is what you do now, what you choose going forward. Maybe that's all any of us can do, try to be better than we were." It wasn't absolution, but it was grace, and Heinrich found himself profoundly grateful for it. He kept the letter, read it when the weight of guilt and shame became too heavy, reminded himself that redemption might be possible, even if forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. Winter in Texas was milder than Kansas, but still cold enough to require the prisoners to huddle in barracks when work details were cancelled due to weather. Heinrich spent much of that time teaching English to other prisoners, helping them prepare for whatever future awaited them. Some planned to stay in America if given the chance, attracted by the opportunities and wanting to escape the devastation of Europe. Others were determined to return home regardless of conditions, unwilling to abandon their families and homeland. Heinrich himself remained undecided. His mother's last letter, which had finally reached him through Red Cross channels, described Stuttgart in ruins, their neighborhood destroyed by Allied bombing, her current home a single room shared with 2 other families. She encouraged him to stay in America if possible, to build a life where buildings still stood and opportunities still existed. But leaving felt like abandonment, like choosing comfort over duty. As winter gave way to spring in 1946, repatriation finally began in earnest. Prisoners were processed in groups, evaluated for political reliability, screened for war crimes, and eventually shipped back to Europe. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and often arbitrary. Some men waited months while others were cleared quickly, with no obvious pattern to the selections. Heinrich's turn came in late April. Colonel Hartwick called him to his office, where Sergeant Coleman and SFC Martinez were already waiting. "You're cleared for repatriation," Hartwick said without preamble. "Ship leaves from New York in 2 weeks. You'll travel by train with a group of 200 prisoners." Heinrich nodded, having expected this. Thank you, sir. Before you go, I want you to know that the work you did here mattered. Waste is down 40%, prisoner satisfaction is up, and we've had 0 food-related incidents since you arrived. That's significant. Hartwick stood, extending his hand. I don't often say this to prisoners, but you did good work, Bauer. I hope you find what you're looking for when you get home. They shook hands, a gesture that felt momentous in its ordinary formality. Coleman stepped forward next, his expression softer than Heinrich had ever seen it. Take care of yourself, kid. And if you ever make it back to Germany, if you ever get your life together over there, remember what you learned here. Remember that food matters, that dignity matters, that treating people right matters, even when you don't have to. I will remember, Sergeant. Thank you for teaching me. The journey back to New York took 3 days, the train rolling through landscapes Heinrich had come to know during his captivity. He saw fields planted by prison labor, farms where German POWs had worked alongside American civilians, small towns that had become familiar during weekend work details. This strange American landscape had been his world for nearly 2 years, long enough to develop a complicated affection for it, even as he prepared to leave. At the port, amid the chaos of loading and processing, Heinrich encountered one final American who'd shaped his captivity. Thomas Patterson had traveled from Kansas specifically to see off prisoners from Concordia who were in Heinrich's repatriation group. The sergeant looked older, more tired than Heinrich remembered, the war years having aged everyone who'd lived through them. Heinrich, Thomas said, grasping his hand firmly, Bobby asked me to give you this. He couldn't make the trip himself, but wanted you to have it before you left. He handed Heinrich a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a letter and a recipe card in familiar handwriting. The recipe was titled Kansas Sunday Bacon, Jenkins Family Traditional Method, and included detailed instructions written in both English and carefully phonetic German. Bobby's letter explained that his mother had helped translate it, that she'd wanted Heinrich to have a piece of their family tradition to carry home. Tell him thank you, Heinrich managed, emotion tightening his throat. Tell him I will never forget what he taught me. I will. And Heinrich, whatever you find when you get home, whatever conditions you're facing, remember that you have value beyond what the war made you. You're a bridge builder, a problem solver. The world needs that now more than ever. The ship departed at dawn, carrying Heinrich and thousands of other German prisoners back across an Atlantic that had changed since they'd crossed it as combatants. He stood at the rail, watching America recede, the recipe card folded carefully in his pocket, Bobby's letter memorized through repeated reading. Germany was a ruin. Everyone on the ship knew that much from letters and news reports. The cities bombed, the infrastructure destroyed, the population traumatized and displaced. Rebuilding would take decades, require resources and will that seemed impossible to imagine. But as Heinrich watched the American coast disappear into morning mist, he found himself thinking about bacon, about the small compromises and careful negotiations that had made camp life bearable, about the possibility that even bitter enemies could find common ground over something as simple as breakfast. He would go home to Stuttgart, or what remained of it. He would find his mother, help her survive whatever came next. And someday, when circumstances allowed, he would rebuild, would create, would honor the lesson he'd learned in a Kansas prison camp. That dignity in small things mattered more than grand gestures, that feeding people well was an act of respect that transcended politics, that remembering your enemy's humanity was the first step toward recovering your own. The bacon had been kitchen trash until it wasn't, until Americans cared enough to meet Germans halfway, until prisoners were willing to accept compromise over pride. Maybe that was what peace looked like, Heinrich thought, as the ship cut through waves toward an uncertain future. Not victory or defeat, not punishment or absolution, but the slow, patient work of finding ways to break bread together despite everything that had tried to make them eternal enemies. He touched the recipe card in his pocket one more time, a talisman against whatever waited on the other side of the ocean. Then he turned from the rail and went below deck, ready to face what came next, carrying with him the unlikely kindness of the Americans who'd fed him, and the equally unlikely grace of having learned to accept it.